I have never agreed more on somebody's analysis of the UK's problem until now. Like, this guy.
If they wanted to teach you, they would, but they won't, so I will. This is definitely going to piss a lot of people off, but it is what it is. Do you want to know why the NHS is collapsing? Why there are major staff shortages and wait times for treatments? It can be pinned down to one thing and one thing only: immigrants.
Immigrants are jarring.
In order to fully understand what I mean by that statement, we first have to take a look at the whole NHS, because most of us just know it as free healthcare. And we laugh at Americans, we really mock them because of their healthcare system, but there are two things that we always get wrong about our own. Firstly, the NHS isn't free. It makes no sense when people say that with their chest. We pay for the NHS through our taxes and national insurance contributions. It's free at the point of use. That is completely different to it just being free. And secondly, our healthcare system in the UK wasn't always like that. The NHS is only 75 years old. Most of your parents and grandparents are older than the NHS is. It was established on the 5th of July 1948, and before then, if you got sick or you needed medical attention, you had to pay for that. And if you didn't have the money, you just had to hold that one. Charge it to the game. Now, there were some charitable voluntary hospitals, but for most working people, you had to pay. Now, the question you might ask is, what changed in 1948 that we were able to have a government-controlled healthcare system that you didn't have to pay for at the point of use? And the answer is immigrants. 1948 saw the first arrivals of the HMT Empire Windrush, which saw Caribbeans enter into the UK by the thousands. The reason being that most, if not all, of the islands in the Caribbean were colonised by the British. Therefore, they were English speaking, and England needed labour to rebuild England after World War II. Many of the men and women that came over from the Caribbean ended up finding roles in the NHS, including my grandmother, who worked in the canteen at the hospital that I was born at in the UK for almost 20 years. Now, the NHS will always talk about the history of their diversity, but believe me, the men and women that came from the Caribbean to work in the NHS were not paid very well, especially compared to their British counterparts. But one thing that immigrants from all over the world are able to do with incredible efficiency is to make more with less. And they most definitely found a way to make it work. Until 1950, there were less than 20,000 non-white people living in Britain, and pretty much none of them were born on British soil. So you know the racism was Champions League level. It was elite. Imagine you uproot your whole life, travel halfway across the world on a boat to help a nation that colonized yours and took all your resources, only to be told to go home by the locals. This wasn't your regular racism. This was top shelf racism. But it was the cheap labour of the Windrush generation that carried the NHS for decades and made it financially viable. But the British people really weren't too happy with these foreign people moving in next door, despite the benefit they had to the community. Regardless though, the immigration continued. In the 50s, 60s and 70s, the South Asian community decided that the UK was the place to be. And then they came and they contributed their cheap labour into the healthcare system that is the NHS. They actually still make up 12.5% of all staff in the NHS today. And you want to know what also happened in the 1960s? Civil and political unrest in Nigeria, along with the UK recruiting skilled workers from the country, saw a load of Nigerians also migrate into the UK. The numbers of not just Nigerians but other African communities migrated into the UK steadily all the way through the 80s into the early 2000s. And what did many of those Africans do? They too came to work in the NHS. So basically, from the NHS's conception, it's relied on cheap labour from immigrant workforces to keep it going for all of these decades. But as soon as each group's population was deemed too much for the UK, new legislations and laws would be passed to stop their immigration into the nation. This was the Brexit before Brexit, the original Brexit, if you will. Now, it's important to note that the children of those immigrants that came to work in the NHS were forced to study in school and do well, so they didn't have to take the abuse and low-paid jobs within the NHS like their parents did. If they did re-enter the NHS, they were being hired as doctors and surgeons. Now, this, paired with the fact that there were less immigrants entering the UK, it left a void of cheap immigrant labour that the NHS needs to be able to continue working. But fear not, because in 1992 in came the Treaty of Maastricht. This made it possible for all people living inside one of the EU nations to be able to move to other EU nations and work for as long as they wanted and stay for as long as they wanted. And naturally, many set their sights on the UK. Doctors and nurses from the EU would provide essential services and assistance to the NHS. But in 2016, the British population voted to leave the EU, and all of that was put to an end. You see, now it puts us in this real novel situation where we're in a bit of a catch-22, because the UK want the NHS that's relied on immigrant labour since its conception, but they don't want the immigrants in the country. Now we're in a situation where the NHS's staff shortages could lead to its collapse.
This man's analysis is on point. The UK was founded on the fact that they want cheap labor, they want immigrants, but they don't want the immigrants. Do you understand? They want to benefit from immigrants, which they are still doing up till tomorrow, but they don't want the immigrants in their country. That's why I just laugh when I see Nigerians commenting and say Nigerians are the problem of the UK. Like, do you know where the origin of the UK's problem is? No matter how much you talk about Canada visa, no matter how much you talk about Australia visa, no matter how you talk about US visa, if they will not issue you visa, they will not. You can be in the queue waiting for Canada visa for 3 good years and they will not give you visa. Unlike the UK, when they need the labor, they open one visa, and then once people have overfilled it, they start complaining. Now, the people who are flocking into the UK, in fact, even the minister went back to his country to go and make collaboration with the people in government in India to say that they will be bringing in more people. Look right front and center in the NHS. What we used to see, Indians, Filipinos, but my own brothers, my own people will be complaining that we are too much, we are talking too much, we are doing. Whereas other people are allowing their people to come into this country, helping their people to come into this country, but because they don't speak English, you don't know. The problem in the NHS or the problem in the UK is not a Nigerian problem. The problem is from the UK. I am so happy with this analysis.